We have gone through various ways of trying to celebrate Dr. King's legacy. Weather has made some of those impossible or made us have to push them off until later. But today we really did want to take some time to talk about Dr. King. For those of you who don't know who Dr. King is, he was an American Baptist preacher who was one of the major influences on the civil rights movement in the United States. He was particularly active from about 1955 until his death in 1968. He preached nonviolence, he preached unity and racial equity, inclusion, economic justice, things that we still struggle with today in our country. He was an amazing leader and a great philosopher and thinker on these matters. So, one of the things we wanted to start off with, some of you may have already seen this video. We sent it out in an email on the holiday itself, but we wanted to show it to you again for those of you who hadn't had the chance to see it. This video is produced by your fellow students, and they talk to students and faculty about what Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy meant to them and what the celebration of the day also meant. So, with no further ado, here is that video.
Hi, I'm Melissa.
I'm Kendall.
I'm Tessely.
And I'm Ema.
We made a video on Martin Luther King and his importance in our community. We asked our peers the questions, what does MLK Day mean to you?
What comes to mind when you think of MLK?
What are 3 words to describe MLK?
And what was MLK's impact on our world today?
I hope you can share the same sentiments that we do about MLK.
And reflect on the importance of MLK Day.
Thank you and enjoy the video.
When I think of MLK Day and Martin Luther King, I think of how much we have grown under the influence of people such as Martin Luther King, and how people of color have more opportunities that we did not have in the past, and how we can further our education and knowledge on social issues.
When I think about Martin Luther King, I think about a person that has a big impact on American history and changes in life.
What comes to mind when I think of MLK is civil rights and the impact he made on the movement.
Martin Luther King, I think about the ideals that he held so dearly that are important to the backbone of this country. And those are the ideals of racial justice, equity, inclusion, diversity, and belonging. I think it's important that we spend time every year, not necessarily just on one day, but throughout the year, to think about the different stories that people have in this country and what it means to work forward together.
When I think of Martin Luther King Jr., what comes to me is an incredible speaker, a man who spoke his mind and who spoke for millions of people, but also a man who could get things done, who could make the decisions and move forward. And especially, right now, I think of Martin Luther King Day being a day of remembrance and reflection, but it also is a day where we have to look forward and look at the work that still needs to be done.
One thing that comes to mind when I think of Martin Luther King is his stone statue up in Washington, D.C. that is left majorly unfinished as a part of a statement that his work is also unfinished. While he is gone, we're left to continue it and work on building a more inclusive community.
When I think of MLK Day, I think of celebrating equality.
When I think of Martin Luther King, I see a great leader, thinker, and pioneer. I immediately think of his speech, I Have a Dream. I know Martin Luther King because of this speech.
What I think about when I think of MLK are the people that he worked alongside with for a more inclusive world, and the people that are still working today for equal opportunity.
When I think of Martin Luther King Jr., I think of a lot of things, but I think the main thing I think of is the mass movement for social justice and a complete system change that he created, and a movement that's still continuing on today.
I think of when I think of Martin Luther King Jr., obviously I think of him. He's an amazing man, not a perfect man, none of us are, but he did such incredible work and was such an incredible force when it came to the civil rights movement.
When I think of MLK, the first thing that comes to mind is integration. Without MLK's fight and his movement, we wouldn't really be able to live in the world we live in. where everybody could come together and, you know, be civil with each other and live, love, and laugh.
MLK Day honors the life of a fighter for racial justice and equality. It celebrates this equality in a society that he dreamed to become colorblind. He stood up to make a difference for every race. His words spoke for every nationality to feel no segregation.
King Day means to me. To me, Martin Luther King Day is a day to reflect upon a great black man and everything he's accomplished within his lifetime and everything that he fought for.
MLK Day to me is a day where we as a community get to look at things that have burdened where we live and the communities that we surround ourselves in for a really long time, and how Martin Luther King chose to fix or try to fix, make aware of a lot of the issues that a lot of our peers and people in our area and in our country face. And I think it's a really good time for reflection and just appreciating what we have and how much further we have to go.
Past him, and I see all the people that walked with him, who came to the March on Washington, who walked through Selma, and who really took the initiative themselves to stand up for what they believed in.
For me, MLK Day is a throwback to the legacy of Martin Luther King, who reminded our nation that we are all equal no matter what.
Filled with lots of hatred.
It's kind of hard to imagine because something Martin Luther King fought heavily for was interracial marriage. And that's kind of the reason I exist. So without that, it's a world I wouldn't live in. So that's something big.
Before the advent of the Civil Rights Movement, the United States was a divided society where rights of a significant part of citizens were infringed. Martin Luther King contributed to the success and continues to impact the Civil Rights Movement in the present. He organized and led marches for Black people's right to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and basic civil rights.
Okay, I think for sure that the world would be different as Black people wouldn't be seen as a majority equal. We'd be seen as a lesser and lesser because prior to everything that happened with MLK and his visionary thoughts, as well as his speeches, Black people were sort of frowned upon and they weren't given the same respect as everyone else.
Who stand up for what we think is right, who understand the needs of our communities and understand the fight for equity throughout all of our populations.
Three things that come to mind when I think about MLK are the civil rights movement, justice, and freedom of speech.
Social justice.
Mind are brave, fearless, and leader.
Courage, breakthrough, and equality.
Determined, intelligent, and courageous.
Dream, peace, and equality.
Loving, smart, and inclusive.
Inspiring, revolutionary, trailblazer.
3 words to describe MLK would be brave, inspirational, and a leader.
Would be hope, truth, and freedom. Honest, courageous, and inspiring.
I think equal rights and freedom, because those are two things he fought very heavily for. And those are two things I also believe in turn.
Talented and brave, and lastly, very influential.
First, I would definitely say he's a phenomenal leader. He led a great movement, and it took a lot for him to do that. Second, I would say he's definitely an intelligent man. He knew what he wanted in life, and he fought for it. He didn't stop to any means, and he kept going. Third, I would say he's definitely brave. Like I said, he fought for what he wanted. He kept going, and nothing got in his way, or whatever did get in his way, he fought around.
In our history classes, we've been taught about Dr. King's dream, one in which every boy and girl and every man and woman is granted fully the rights and privileges promised by the Constitution. Dr. King tells us that the road to achieve this is not one in which we can walk alone. It takes the courage of a community to stand up and hold hands and march ahead to achieve this dream. Just as communities gathered in the name of social justice during the Civil Rights Movement, let us in our own communities gather to change our world for the better.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here along with our wonderful faculty, an impressive group of students who have worked really hard to bring you this presentation today. And despite the snowstorms and the delays, we as a community have been absolutely committed to recognizing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his work. So what is the purpose of MLK Day? According to the National Constitutional Center, today the King holiday serves multiple purposes. So it honors the total legacy of King. It focuses on the issue of civil rights, of course, highlights the use of nonviolence to promote change, and it calls people into public service. I think that's the part that many of us may not be aware of. So I have to say that it's really remarkable that we're all here today for this purpose. I mean, agreeing to recognize Dr. King on a certain day in the United States did not come naturally to us as Americans. Much like the civil rights movement itself, establishing MLK Day was a long, hard-fought crusade to get our federal government and then every single one of the 50 states to agree to recognize his day of birth. So this began in 1968, 4 days after King was assassinated. Representative John Conyers from Michigan, he was my representative when I was growing up. He was there forever. He advocated for a national holiday immediately in King's honor. It took 11 years just to get a vote. Just to vote, should we recognize King? And for a bit of historical context, that was the year I was born. For 32 more years, this continued on with many lawmakers, activists, civil rights leaders, supporters, and celebrities, average citizens trying to fight to get King recognized. So despite support from all of these places, members of Congress, President Jimmy Carter in 1979, the measure completely failed to pass, 252 to 133. So quick math, that's 119 representatives in 1979 who did not want to support recognizing Dr. King with a federal holiday. Fast forward to 1981, supporters of the King holiday tried again to get the necessary support to nationally celebrate him. And you had Motown legend Stevie Wonder. Anybody? Stevie Wonder? Yes? Okay. He sang a song called Happy Birthday. And to advance this cause, and he said in his lyrics, you know, it doesn't make much sense. There ought to be a law against anyone who takes offense at a day in your celebration. Because we all know in our minds that there ought to be a time that we can set aside to show just how much we love you. In 1983, the King Center, led by Coretta Scott King, his widow, organized a march of 500,000 people in Washington. This is 1983, where they presented a petition with 6 million signatures to the leader of the House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill, to support, again, a holiday recognizing Dr. King. And the House of Representatives did indeed take up that bill that year, and it passed by only 53 votes, which is definitely not an overwhelming majority. And if you know anything about our US government, we've got our House of Reps, and then we've got the Senate. Well, in the Senate, there was lots of talk about King being a communist and how, you know, this was not a great idea. There's a lot of pushback. But despite this, the bill did actually pass by 12 votes. President Ronald Reagan signed it, and when it was ratified, Coretta Scott King said, this is not a black holiday. It is a people's holiday. So the first celebration of King's birthday as a national holiday was 1986. I was 6 years old, and I remember very vividly talking about and celebrating Dr. King in elementary school all the way on through, growing up outside Detroit. And I was interested to find out that in Pennsylvania, back in 1978, the Governor Shapp, had already created a state holiday. And besides Atlanta, Georgia, Philadelphia, of all places, just a couple hours from here, has always had a significant recognition and celebration of King consistently. But of course, there were quite a few places that were openly hostile to this holiday. According to Time magazine in 1986, Buffalo, New York, somebody whitewashed a statue of King on that first holiday. And then you had states that recreated the holiday's name with things like Robert E. Lee / Martin Luther King birthday, or Lee Jackson King Day. Lee and Jackson being the Confederate generals who led the South in its rebellion against the United States during the American Civil War. And this practice finally ended in the year 2000, when Virginia, South Carolina, and Utah, being the last 3 states to finally recognize the federal holiday honoring King's birthday, just King. That was 22 years ago. I was a junior in college. So all of this to say that it's been a long road to our collective American culture coming together to agree that we want to honor Dr. King and all his work fighting for peace and the eradication of poverty, racial equality, and justice, as well as advocating for service. So I'll say it again, it is really remarkable that we're here today in the name of Dr. King. He was a subversive and controversial figure in his lifetime. And I think that newer generations, like all of you, may assume that King is and always has been a national hero. And I think maybe that notion is a real testament to the progress we've made over the last 50-odd years. So despite how slowly progress can seem, here we are today, this morning, at Wyoming Seminary, still proudly reflecting on and recognizing Dr. King's work and legacy. So I want to sincerely thank everyone that was involved with bringing this assembly together today. Thanks so much.
In 1954, Martin Luther King Jr. was a young Baptist minister assigned to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, as he finished up his PhD dissertation at Boston University. While not yet a well-known activist in the civil rights movement, King's study of Christian theology would become foundational to his later work as a civil rights leader. In a sermon, Transformed Nonconformist, given at Dexter Ave Baptist Church in November of 1954, King examines the Christian imperatives of standing up for someone's beliefs, no matter the cost.
Men are afraid to stand alone for their convictions. There are those who have high and noble ideals, but they never feel them because they are afraid of being nonconformist. I've seen so many white people who sincerely oppose segregation and discrimination, but they never took a real stand against it because of fear of standing alone. I've seen so many young people and older people alike develop undesirable habits, not because they wanted to do it in the beginning, not even because they enjoyed it, but because they were ashamed of saying no, while everyone else was saying yes. Even the Christian church has often been afraid to stand up for what's right because the majority didn't sanction it. The church has too been often institutions seeking to crystallize and conserve the patterns of crowd. The mere fact that slavery, segregation, war, and economic exploitation have been sanctioned by the church is a fit testimony to the fact that the church has to conform to the authority to the world rather than the authority of God. But my friends, it is the nonconformists that have made history, not those who always look to see which way the majority is before they make a decision, not those who are afraid to say no when everybody else is saying yes. But history has been made by those who could stand before the crowd and not bow. The great creative insights have come from men who are in minority. It was the minority that fought for religious liberty. It was the minority that brought about the freedom of scientific research in any cause that concerns the progress of mankind. Put your faith in the nonconformist. Thank you.
Violence was common during the years of the struggle for civil rights.
Those who opposed the movement and were infuriated by the nonviolent stance of leaders such as Dr. King often resorted to lashing out at the Black community in horrific ways. On Sunday, September 15th, 1963, at 10:34 a.m., a bomb set by the Ku Klux Klan exploded in a back stairwell of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The church, which was known to be a meeting place for civil rights activists, had been targeted repeatedly with bomb threats by white supremacists. More than 20 people were injured in the attack, and 4 Black girls, 14-year-old Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, and Carol Robertson, and 11-year-old Denise McNair were killed, their bodies discovered in the ruins of a basement bathroom. 3 days later, Dr. King spoke at the funeral for Addie Mae, Cynthia, and Denise, calling for their deaths to not be in vain.
These children, unoffending, innocent, and beautiful, were the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. And yet, they died nobly. They are the martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity. And so, this afternoon, in a real sense, they have something to say to each of us in their death. They have something to say to every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. They have something to say to every politician who has fed his constituents with the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. They have something to say to a federal government that is compromised with the undemocratic practices of Southern Dixiecrats and the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing Northern Republicans. They have something to say to every Negro who has passively accepted the evil system of segregation and who has stood on the sidelines of a mighty struggle for justice. They say to each of us, Black and white alike, that we must substitute courage for caution. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers. Their death says to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly for the realization of the American dream. And so, my friends, they did not die in vain. God still has a way of bringing good out of evil, and history has proven over and over again that unmerited suffering is redemptive. The innocent blood of these little girls may well serve as a redemptive force that will bring new light to this dark city. The Holy Scripture says, "A little child shall lead them." The death of these little children may lead our whole Southland from the low road of man's inhumanity to man to the high road of peace and brotherhood. These tragic deaths may lead our nation to substitute an aristocracy of character for an aristocracy of color. The spilled blood of these innocent girls may cause the whole citizenry of Birmingham to transform the negative extremes of a dark past into the positive extremes of a bright future. Indeed, this tragic event may cause the white South to come to terms with its conscience. And so, I stand here to say this afternoon to all assembled here that in spite of the darkness of this hour, we must not despair. We must not become bitter, nor must we harbor the desire to retaliate with violence. No, we must not lose faith in our white brothers. Somehow, we must believe that the most misguided among them can learn to respect the dignity and the worth of all human personality.
A major issue for the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s was voting rights for Black Americans. Many Black men and women were disenfranchised or stopped from voting, and often faced strong resistance in southern states, not only when they attempted to vote, but also when they tried to register to vote. In 1965, Dr. King and other movement leaders organized a 54-mile march from Selma, Alabama to the state capital of Montgomery, hoping to raise awareness of the issue of voting rights and to put pressure on the federal government. The march took 3 days in March 1965, and protesters were accompanied by the National Guard along the way in order to assure their safety as they traveled through areas hostile to the concept of civil rights. The march and others like it led to the successful passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibits racial discrimination in voting. On March 25th, 1965, at the conclusion of the march, when the activists had reached Montgomery, Dr. King had this to say.
Last Sunday, more than 8,000 of us started on a mighty walk from Selma, Alabama. We have walked through desolate valleys and across trying hills. We have walked on mead-daring highways and rested our bodies on rocky byways. Some of our faces are burned from the outpourings of the threatening sun. Some have literally slept in the mud. We have been drenched by the rains. Our bodies are tired and our feet are somewhat sore. But today I stand before you and think back over the Great March. I can say, as Sister Paul had said, a 70-year-old Negro woman who lived in the community during the bus boycott, and one day she was asked while walking if she didn't want to ride, and she answered no. Then the person said, "Well, aren't you tired?" And with her ungrammatical profundity, she said, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." And in a real sense this afternoon, we can say that our feet are tired, but our souls are rested. They told us we wouldn't get here, and there were those who said that we would get here only by over their dead bodies. But all the world today knows that we are here, and we are standing before the forces of the power in the state of Alabama saying, we ain't gonna let no one turn us around.
Dr. King was known for his stance against the Vietnam War. Through the first years of the war, King was troubled not only by the increasing loss of life on both the US and the Vietnam sides, but of the conflict and how it was growing immensely expensive for the United States, spending immense amounts of money that were being diverted toward the war effort that he thought would be best put in fighting against poverty, both here in the United States and abroad. On April 4th, 1967, King gave a sermon at the Riverside Church in New York City, clarifying his anti-war stance and claiming that it was a moral imperative that the United States stop the war through nonviolent means.
We still have a choice today: nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. We must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace in Vietnam and justice throughout the developing world, a world that borders on our doors. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the sons of God, and our brothers wait eagerly for our response. Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell them the struggle is too hard? Will our message be that the forces of American life militate against their arrival as full men, and we send our deepest regrets? Or will there be another message of longing, of hope, of solidarity with their earnings, of commitment to their cause, whatever the cost? The choice is ours, and though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
Poverty in America was a major concern for Dr. King. He had seen firsthand the damage lifelong poverty could do to people, and he frequently spoke out for Americans who were financially struggling to make ends meet. In 1967, 10 days after he spoke out against the Vietnam War at Riverside Church, Dr. King met with the faculty, staff, and students at Stanford University. In his speech entitled "The Other America," Dr. King underscored the need for economic justice in our country, pointing out the ways in which those individuals living below the poverty line experienced an entirely different aspect of American life and culture.
There are literally two Americas. One America is a beautiful situation, and in a sense, this America is overflowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of opportunity. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, and culture and education for their minds, and freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, millions of people experience every day the opportunity of having life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in all of their dimensions. And in this America, millions of young people grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. But tragically and unfortunately, there is another America. The other America has a daily ugliness about it that constantly transforms the ebulliency of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this America, millions of work-starved men walk the streets daily in search of jobs that do not exist. In this America, millions of people find themselves living in rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. In this America, people are poor by the millions. They find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. In a sense, the greatest tragedy in this other America is what it does to little children. Little children in this other America are forced to grow up with the clouds of inferiority forming every day in their little mental skies. As we look at this other America, we see it as an arena of blasted hopes and shattered dreams. Many people of various backgrounds live in this other America. Some are Mexican Americans, some are Puerto Ricans, some are Indians, and some happen to be from other groups. Millions of them are Appalachian whites, but probably the largest group in this other America in proportion to its size in the population is the American Black. So what we are seeking to do in the civil rights movement is to deal with this problem, to deal with the problem of the two Americas. We are seeking to make this America one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The more Dr. King spoke up for racial equity, economic justice, and peace, the more he faced the fury of Southern hate groups and other individuals desperate to silence him. Death threats became a daily way of life for Dr. King and his family. After the assassination of President John F. Kennedy Jr. in 1963, Dr. King told his wife, Coretta Scott King, "This is what is going to happen to me also." Still, Dr. King kept speaking, kept protesting, kept pressing American society to stand on the right side of history. In early April of 1968, Dr. King flew from Atlanta to Memphis, Tennessee, to speak in support of striking sanitation workers, many of whom were Black Americans, and who were paid significantly less than their white counterparts. King, who had been in Memphis only a week before to participate in an unsuccessful march for the workers, returned on April 3rd to organize another march. His plane was delayed due to a bomb threat, but he reached Memphis in time to give one last speech entitled, "I've Been to the Mountaintop," at the national headquarters of the Church of God in Christ.
I left Atlanta this morning, and as we got started on the plane, there were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, "We are sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane, and to be sure that all the bags were checked and to be sure that nothing would be wrong with the plane, we had to check out everything carefully. And we've had the plane protected and guarded all night." And then I got into Memphis, and some began to say the threats or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land.
One day later, April 4th, 1968. It's nearly 6 o'clock in the evening at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. King was staying in room 306, a room he often frequented when he was in Memphis. Dr. King was leaning against the balcony railing, speaking to Reverend Jesse Jackson. At 6:01, a shot rang out. A bullet struck Dr. King, knocking him backwards onto the balcony. Dr. King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, but he never regained consciousness. At 7:05 p.m., Dr. King was pronounced dead. 2 months later, James Earl Ray was arrested at London's Heathrow Airport and extradited to the United States. He pled guilty to Dr. King's murder and was sentenced to 99 years in the Tennessee State Penitentiary for the crime. While Ray was the only person indicted in a criminal case, other individuals, including a Memphis restaurateur named Lloyd Jowers, were accused of helping to plot the assassination in a later civil case. The news of Dr. King's death rocked the United States and the civil rights movement. Dr. King was mourned across the country by Americans of all backgrounds.
Direct from our newsroom in Washington, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Russ Hodge in Memphis, Tennessee, Dan Rather in New York, Bernard Kalb in Saigon, Marvin Kalb in Wellington, New Zealand, and Bert Quint in Quezon, South Vietnam.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene. Officers also reportedly chased and fired on a radio-equipped car containing 2 white men. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of a second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In the friend's words, the bullet exploded in his face. Police, who have been keeping a close watch over the Nobel Peace Prize winner because of Memphis' turbulent racial situation, were on the scene almost immediately. They rushed the 39-year-old Negro leader to a hospital where he died of a bullet wound in the neck. Police said they found a high-powered hunting rifle about a block from the hotel, but it was not immediately identified as the murder weapon. Mayor Henry Loeb has reinstated the dusk-to-dawn curfew he imposed on the city last week when a march led by Dr. King erupted in violence. Governor Buford Ellington has called out 4,000 National Guardsmen. And police report that the murder has touched off sporadic acts of violence in a Negro section of the city. In a nationwide television address, President Johnson expressed the nation's shock.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence.
Dr. King had returned to Memphis only yesterday, determined to prove that he could lead a peaceful mass march in support of striking sanitation workers, most of whom are Negroes. Dr. King had this to say last night about the situation in Memphis.
Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for rights.
There was shock in Harlem tonight when word of Dr. King's murder reached the nation's largest Negro community. Men, women, and children poured into the streets. They appeared dazed. Many were crying. A young Negro said, Dr. King didn't really have to go back to Memphis. Maybe he wanted to prove something.
I'd like to invite a group of my friends and some volunteers to come up on stage. We're going to sing a rallying song that has been so very important to people in the civil rights, We Shall Overcome. If you'll come up and join us, please. This is a song that comes from a great spiritual tradition of many slave songs that have been passed on through the oral tradition. We Shall Overcome, we know, actually is a tune from about 1600. It was used on a slave ship. But this tune is still around with us.
O God of grace and glory, we remember before you this day Martin Luther King, Jr. Give us faith so that in quiet confidence, like that of Dr. King's, we may continue our course on earth to share Dr. King's legacy, to bring forth peace and to bring forth community, and to love and support one another through all the days that come. Amen. You are dismissed.